Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming, and good evening. I'm so excited to see everyone's faces tonight, and on behalf of the Art History Student Association, or ASA, at the University of Utah, I'd like to welcome you all to this first of 3 Zoom lecture events hosted by ASA. If you're interested in becoming a member of ASA, I can provide you with a link that allows you to do so in the chat. If you would like to enable automatic closed captioning for tonight's recorded lecture, you may do so by selecting the closed captioning tab at the bottom bar of your screen. I think it's called Live Transcript if you would like to utilize that. Tonight's lecture will be given by Dr. Connie Choi from the Studio Museum Harlem. My name is Avery Gregg, and I'm the president of ASA, and I'm joined here today by my vice president, Cynthia Shaw, our faculty advisor, Sarah Hollenberg, as well as many other members of ASA. I'm also excited to see individuals completely outside of our organization who are here to gain some insight into the workings of Black Refractions, highlights from the Studio Museum in Harlem exhibit, which is currently on display at the Utah Museum of Fine Arts, or UMFA, and will be on view until April 10th of this year. If you have not already and you have the opportunity, I highly encourage that you pay the UMFA a visit and to experience this wonderful exhibit that we are so lucky to have. The ASA lecture events this semester, which are sponsored by the Fine Arts Fees Grants Funds, are focusing on matters of diversity, activism, and justice work in the arts and museum fields. Our goal for this lecture series is to bring in diverse voices in a time where talking boldly about racial injustices and inequalities is urgently necessary. In March of 2019, the world was hit with the COVID-19 pandemic. This has undisputedly caused all of our worlds to shift dramatically. It is imperative to note that the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected the Black, Indigenous, and POC community, or BIPOC communities. Shortly after the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic last spring came a string of Black Lives Matter protests in the summer, specifically against systemic racism and police brutality. The call for racial justice in America for BIPOC individuals is not a new concept and is not a time when the fight for equality and anti-racism can ever relax. Expression through art is one of the most powerful ways of sharing stories, connecting perspectives, and conveying messages for us all to experience. The lecture series and our array of wonderful speakers allows us as a community to engage in the necessary discourse surrounding racial and social injustices. The Black Refractions, highlights from the Studio Museum Harlem exhibit, is one of great importance. The exhibit provides opportunity for in-depth engagement and much-needed representation via a prestigious array of Black artists and artists of African descent. We are so grateful for the opportunity to host Dr. Connie Choi tonight because of her role in the Black Refractions exhibit. The exhibition is a traveling exhibition from the Studio Museum Harlem in Harlem, New York, and was created in partnership with the American Federation of Arts. It has a wide array of works ranging from the early 1900s to contemporary, and includes a vast array of mediums, including painting, sculpture, video media, tapestry, quilts, and photography. The collection presents prestigious African-American artists, including Kine Wiley, Faith Ringgold, Norman Lewis, and David Hammond, and so much more. The exhibition shares the Studio Museum Harlem's value of community and supporting individual artists, all grounded in its identity in Harlem with audiences here in Utah. Dr. Connie Choi is the Associate Curator at the Permanent Collection at the Studio Museum Harlem. She is an art history PhD from Columbia University in New York and has an arts education master's degree from Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Connie has been a part of many exhibitions, including fiction regarding the figure, Their Own Harlems, and of course, Black Refractions. We are honored to have the opportunity to host Dr. Connie Choi tonight for an enriching lecture on her work in the curation of the Black Refractions exhibit. Following tonight's lecture will be a Q&A session with Dr. Connie Choi. On behalf of all of us here tonight over Zoom, I'd love to extend a warm welcome to Connie. I will now pass things over to her.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction and welcome, and for the invitation to speak here tonight. I've enjoyed working with both Avery and Cynthia over the course of the past few weeks and thinking about what this lecture could be. I am going to talk pretty informally in terms of just walking you through the curatorial process in this exhibition. So I'll start a little bit with my background in terms of how I came to be at the Studio Museum and the kind of initial curatorial framework of the exhibition, focusing specifically on the formation of the institution, which opened to the public in 1968, and what was going on socially and politically in that moment. And then going into the actual works themselves and thinking about a larger curatorial framework for what what themes we were thinking through as we were forming the checklist. And then I'm hoping that there will be plenty of times for questions afterwards, so I look forward to hearing from you all. I am going to share my screen now. Okay. So I joined the Studio Museum in February 2017, and I was told when I started that this would be the main project I would be working on. And it opened to the public at the first venue, the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco in January 2019. So as you can imagine, that was a pretty quick turnaround just in terms of first getting to know an institution, getting to know a collection on top of that, and then putting together an exhibition. You know, these things all take time. And so I entered into the institution knowing that getting to know the collection was of the utmost importance, and also getting to know the institution's history, which I think is something that perhaps sometimes we don't think about in terms of how that affects our understanding of the collection and of the exhibition program. So the curatorial process was such that the institution, the Studio Museum in Harlem, had already started conversations with the American Federation of Arts prior to my arrival, and had an understanding with them in terms of partnering together to create this touring show. And it was partially born out of the need to think about what this collection could look like and where it would live in the moment of our building project. For those of you who don't know, the Studio Museum is actually closed in large part due to a major construction project that we're doing, where we're building our first purpose-built facility for the institution. I'll get into some of where we started before, and you'll see the two buildings that we've existed in prior to this moment. So we knew that we were going to be going through a major construction phase over the course of a number of years. And so we wanted to think about the ways in which this collection could live on in an expanded version of a community, right? What would it look like for this collection to be shown across the United States in a moment when the museum itself was closed in Harlem? So out of that, then started a really long conversation with the AFA in terms of thinking about what this exhibition could be. As you can imagine, it's not that easy to put together a collection exhibition. Our collection is not that large compared to other institutions. I know the UMFA has a much larger collection than we do. We are about between 2,500 and 3,000 works of art over the course of over 200 years of Black artistic production. But every work is so special. And so the process of creating this checklist actually took almost a year to do. And that was in a lot of deep conversation with not only the institution, right, thinking about collaborating with my colleagues within the Studio Museum, but also with the AFA. And this exhibition ended up being about 120 objects, with the understanding that some of these works, which are works on paper, are light sensitive and therefore can't be shown at every venue. So the first 3 venues of the show got a certain amount of works, which ended up being just under 100 works. And then about 20 of those works were rotated out halfway through. So the UMFA has the second half of the light sensitive works on paper in that show. And also the understanding that each exhibition space is different, each audience is different, and the sizes of the galleries are different. And so we really wanted to make sure that the exhibition was flexible in terms of allowing the venues to create their own installation in a way that benefited their own mission, but also their own audiences, right? The underlying understanding, that doesn't really make sense. The underlying thought process for us as we were coming up with what this exhibition meant was that there is no one singular narrative of quote unquote Black art. It doesn't exist, right? You can't say chronologically that this is what happened from A to Z and have a linear line, right? The great thing about art is that it's always in conversation with each other, right? It's always in tension with each other. And so we wanted to celebrate that, to acknowledge that. And we didn't want to force an institution, other institutions, to follow a specific way to see an exhibition or to walk through an exhibition. And so what's been so wonderful about this whole process has been that this exhibition has never lived at the Studio Museum, right? I've never installed this exhibition for my home institution. So I only know these works physically through each of these venues, which has been an amazing experience because each venue, the works look different, right? Depending on how the exhibition, the venue curators have installed the show, the conversations that they've created based on the juxtapositions that they're seeing in these works, how they've interpreted these works. And so it's been such a wonderful experience working with curators across the country, Whitney Tassie at UMFA, in thinking through what this exhibition means for each of these specific audiences. And so that whole process has meant that, yes, it's one exhibition, but it's in actuality 6 very different exhibitions, which has meant that I've worked on this show not only for the 4 years, but also I've worked on 6 different exhibitions in that time, which has been fantastic, but also pretty crazy. So all of that just to say that in thinking about the show again, I wanted to go back to thinking about that moment in the institution's founding, primarily because I am a mid-20th century person. The Studio Museum in Harlem has a reputation for being a contemporary arts institution, which it very much is, and it has always been a contemporary arts institution. So for me to think about that founding moment was incredibly important in order to even begin to understand what a show could look like that was a celebration of the Studio Museum in Harlem. Okay. So to actually get into some images, so I'm showing you 2 images here from the original location of the institution, which was at 2033 Fifth Avenue between 125th Street and 126th Street. It was in a 2nd-story loft. So here you see that raw space. And you see our founding director right here, Charles Innes, along with some other early members and founders, trustees, and other people who were involved in the formation of the institution. And in seeing these images, you have to think like, what did it take to actually build an institution from scratch? What did it take to actually found an institution that didn't exist before? And that was facing enormous pressure, right? Like the idea of creating an institution that celebrated, acknowledged, exhibited, supported the work of artists of African descent was incredibly new and bold as a concept, right? And so thinking through that really helped shape the show because I wanted the exhibition to be something that celebrated and acknowledged that, but also pushed it forward, right, into thinking about conversations that we are continuing to have and that we still have by necessity. So again, 2 more archival images of our exhibition or our institution's founding. You see here the original home of the museum, the exterior, and you'll notice that, let's see, here was the entrance to that 2nd floor space right next to the liquor store. And then this is the space that we occupied. And so thinking again about the rootedness of community in our founding, right? We were literally located on 5th Avenue between 125th Street and 126th. 125th Street, for those of you who don't know, in Harlem is the thoroughfare. It is the lifeblood of Harlem. It's where you see all of the vibrancy of Harlem. It's where Apollo Theater is located. It's where so many other cultural institutions are located. And so being just off of that was incredibly important, right? In terms of people having access and understanding what the institution was. And then on the right here, we have some of our founders outside of the entrance to the loft space on opening night on September 1968, and I'm just going to name them here because it's important for us to name names. Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is currently representative, Congresswoman representing Washington, D.C. Carter Burden, Charles Innes, who was our first director, Campbell Wiley, Betty Blayton Taylor, an amazing artist and educator, and Frank Donnelly. And so this was really a way, it was an incredibly important moment for the institution to finally be open. A lot of the people that were involved in the founding of our institution began thinking about the formation of a museum several years earlier. So in the mid 1960s is when people really started to gather together and think about what it would mean to open an institution. And importantly, our name, our museum's name, really speaks to the completeness of our mission itself, right? And so studio being studio space, it's being, centralizing the importance of the artist to the institution's mission, supporting the work of living artists in particular, if we think about studio space, right? Museum being a fine arts institution, showing and exhibiting the work of artists. And in Harlem, that bit in Harlem is incredibly important in the museum. To the museum because it located us in a very specific neighborhood, a neighborhood that has had such a rich cultural history. When we think of Harlem, of course, we think of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s and 30s. That was an incredible flowering of artistic production across the cultural sphere. And so our name as a whole really speaks to the our mission in total. So it's really very succinct in terms of how we consider ourselves as an institution. Okay. So what was happening in the world at that time? In the mid 1960s, as you know, we're in the height of the civil rights movement. 1964, we see the signing of the 64 Civil Rights Act by Lyndon B. Johnson. And this is after a lot of nonviolent protests and agitations and work done by civil rights activists around the country. And then in 1965, we have the ongoing civil rights battles all around the country. Here I'm showing you on the right an image of John Lewis and Hosea Williams on the first of three marches that they attempted from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, where they're stopped by Alabama state troopers and savagely physically attacked, and it became known as Bloody Sunday. And so we have both of these things kind of happening at the same time within the larger civil rights movements, where we have some moments of extreme celebration and joy, right? Things happening on the federal and state level that were allowing for rights for people of color. 1965 was also the year of the Voting Rights Act. But then on the other hand, continued violence against people of African descent around this country. And so that was also happening very much in the later 1960s when the museum actually opened to the public. And so within 1968 itself, it's considered such a watershed year in US history because so much happened within those 12 months that really kind of laid the foundation for what was happening in the United States for years afterwards. And so on the upper left here, you see MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy together. And of course in 68 was when they were both assassinated. And on the bottom left here, we have a protest from the Black Panther Party protesting the arrest of one of their co-founders. And then also in addition to these types of protests, we also had protests against the US's involvement in the Vietnam War, some of these protests turning more violent. And then on the right, we have Tommie Smith and John Carlos at the 1968 Summer Olympics, which ironically happened in October. So a couple of weeks after the Studio Museum opened to the public, raising their fists in the Black Power salute, and an incredible moment of international acknowledgement and recognition of the Black Power struggle. So 1968 as a whole was just an incredible year in terms of a lot of the political activity that started to take that had taken a center stage, but had really kind of coalesced in a particular moment. And within the 1960s, a lot was happening in the artistic world as well. So we had, starting in 1963, so the earlier 1960s, kind of the flowering of Black artist organizations, Black artist collectives, artists really understanding the necessity to band together, to support one another, to serve as critics for one another, and to band together also as a way to agitate, right? To come up with ways to increase their own visibility and their own exhibition opportunities and collecting opportunities. And so showing you an image on the left here of the Komoinge group, which formed in 1963, as did Spiral, which was another artist collective that was founded by artists that I'll speak about later who are in the show. And then at center here, Leroy Jones, who later changed his name to Amiri Baraka, an amazing poet who founded the Black Arts Repertory Theater School in Harlem in 1965. And that moment is really considered the unofficial start of the Black arts movement. And so the Black arts movement working in tandem with the Black Power movement as a way to think really critically about what it meant to think about the arts broadly, so not just visual arts, but poetry and literature and theater in a way that was very much aligned with the mission of the Black Power movement. And then on the left, on the right, additional arts or additional cultural organizations forming in the later 1960s that are still in existence today. So I'm showing you an image of the Dance Theater of Harlem, which celebrated its 50th anniversary recently, but also the National Black Theater, formed in, I think, 1968. El Museo del Barrio, formed, I think, in 69. And so we have really a core group of cultural organizations that were mission specific, that were focused on either Black or Latinx artists and the arts, that allowed for kind of an overall understanding of what it meant to support the work of artists of color. On the other side of that, though, if we're thinking about all the things that were happening politically in the political realm, that extended into the cultural realm as well, right? And so the later 1960s were an incredible moment in terms of artists really banding together to advocate for themselves and for other artists. And so there's a number of artists in Black Refractions who led that charge, who were really instrumental in breaking down the doors at some of these other institutions in New York City, and did that in a way that was very well organized and thought out, but also very public, in order to demand and insist on their presence in these spaces. And so on the left here, you see Norman Lewis protesting Harlem on My Mind, which was that incredibly controversial 1969 exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, notable for the fact that it didn't include a work by a single Black artist, aside from reproductions of photographs by James Van Der Zee, who was in Black Refractions. On the right here, we have Benny Andrews protesting outside of the Contemporary Black Artists in America show at the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1971. So both of these exhibitions opening after the Studio Museum opened, but important in terms of thinking about how artists were understood, right? Understood their importance and understood the importance of not only opening those doors for themselves, but for others. And so by 1971, for the Contemporary Black Artists in America show, it wasn't about the fact that the Whitney wasn't exhibiting the work of Black artists, right? They had started doing that in 1969 as a result of some of these earlier protests. It was more about the fact that there was such a resistance to hiring Black curatorial staff, to hiring, Black staff in general at these institutions at a more senior level. And so the protest for the Contemporary Black Artists in America show was specifically about that, right? It's not just about exhibiting the work of Black artists, it's about investing in Black intellectual thought as well. And so at center here, we have a document that was created by members of the Art Workers Coalition, which is another larger art collective that wasn't specifically focused on Black artists, but was formed out of the result of a protest at the Museum of Modern Art. So we have all three major New York City institutions implicated in this moment. And you see, they're very clear in their demands, right? They're demanding that Harlem on My Mind is canceled. They're demanding that Black Black staff at a curatorial and senior level are hired, and they're demanding that the Metropolitan Museum involve themselves in the Black community. And so there was a larger understanding of these considerations that were necessary in order to break down those barriers at all levels. That was incredibly important in understanding why and how the Studio Museum was formed. So the opening moment. As many of you may have seen already, I know that a lot of you did go to see the show already. That first gallery really kind of opens with Tom Lloyd. I mean, it's hard not to see this work. It is an incredible light-based, electronically programmed work. Tom Lloyd has such a deep, rich history with the Studio Museum, and you can't talk about the Studio Museum without talking about him. He opened up the museum. His solo exhibition, Electronic Refractions 2, was the opening exhibition in September 1968. And the reason why it was the opening exhibition, there are several reasons. The first was that he was the first artist selected for the studio program. So again, that word studio being incredibly important to the institution's mission. The studio program provided an artist working in non-traditional materials, so generally outside of painting and traditional sculpture, with funds in the creation of new works of art that were then exhibited, right? And so it was about, again, supporting the work of living artists and supporting the work of kind of experimental artists too. And the other side of that was very rooted in education. The Studio Museum was formed with this dual understanding of the importance of not only the arts and supporting artists, but also the importance of education and community that is really reflected in kind of these early exhibitions and the early support that they had with their founding initiatives. So the education component of this program was that it provided the opportunity for young people, they're called young apprentices, to work directly with the artists in the creation of these works. So you see that here, these young people helping Tom Lloyd build these sculptures. This exhibition was groundbreaking in a lot of ways, not only because it opened the Studio Museum, but because it was actually quite controversial. You know, the museum's founders were very deliberate about what exhibition they were going to open with, right? Because they knew that it was going to be a newsworthy event. They knew that it would set the stage for how the institution would be perceived now, then, and into the future. And by choosing an artist such as Tom Lloyd, who's working in, light-based work that was generally understood as being pretty experimental and new, they were making a stance about how they saw themselves, how they saw the institution within the larger art world, right? It's a very deliberate choice to make. And people had problems with it, even within the Harlem community, right? And so there's a story about how someone came into the opening and was upset about the fact that the works on view did not look like quote unquote Black art, right? This person came in thinking that very specifically that there was a certain understanding of what Black art was, meaning that it was figurative, that it was understandable in terms of being social realist in bent perhaps, or just works that reflected him, right? And the museum very deliberately did not do that. And they didn't do that not just for this exhibition, but for the whole inaugural year pretty much. And so in terms of the founding moment and this exhibition, we did want to think about how to acknowledge that and honor that with Black refractions. And so you'll recognize that we use the word refractions in the show, which is taken directly from Tom Lloyd's exhibition Electronic Refractions 2, but also because it made so much more sense just in terms of how we were thinking about telling multiple stories, right? The refraction of light, but also the refraction of these works, right? How they reverberate out, that there's no, again, one narrative. So going quickly through this inaugural year of the show, just so you can, or inaugural year of the institution, just so you can kind of get a sense of what the museum did. It exhibited works from a wide range of cultures, but time periods, artists, etc. On the left here, you see pretty bad shot of X to the Fourth Power, which featured works by Melvin Edwards, Sam Gilliam, and William T. Williams, who are all in Black refractions, and then a white artist named Stephen Kelsey. So again, that inclusion of a white artist was a deliberate choice. William T. Williams organized the show, but one that was criticized by some people. And then on the right here, you have an installation shot that's actually taken from the De Young Museum of a traveling exhibition on photographs of the Black Panthers. So again, the institution being very deliberate in terms of opening themselves up, thinking about contemporary issues and this political moment. Oops. The three other exhibitions that rounded out at its inaugural year, Invisible Americans, which was a counter exhibition to the show at the Whitney that was about American painters and sculptors that didn't include a single Black artist, which made no sense given that the Harlem Renaissance took place in the 1930s. And so the fact that there was no Black artist was, just an incredible lack of understanding of the contributions of artists of African descent. Afro-Haitian images and sound today, so thinking more about a diasporic understanding of Black culture. And then Harlem Artist 69, so again, being rooted deeply in the community of Harlem and exhibiting works by artists who were either living and working in Harlem or who had a relationship to Harlem. Okay, so to get into the actual exhibition, now that I've talked for a really long time about the forming of the museum. The museum opened with a very deliberate mission that did not include a collection. The founders of the institution were very much against a collection because they felt that it would hold them down, that it would prevent them from being responsive to the moment, to the community, that it would tie them down to specific works of art and specific artists. And so for the first 9 years of the institution's life, it did not have a collecting policy. However, artists were the ones who recognized the importance of a collection for the institution. They understood that their work needed to be preserved and cared for not only the works themselves, but also for future audiences, right? They understood the importance of being in an institutional collection for their own legacies. And so they began donating works in 1970, so just 2 years after the museum opened to the public. This work, El Zir Cortor, is the first painting that was gifted to the Studio Museum in 1971, not by the artist or by an artist, but by a collector. But I find it to be really remarkable just in terms of thinking about the institution and its mission at that time. And the fact that at that moment, even in that moment, it was so focused on celebrating the work of contemporary artists, artists working in that moment, right, late 1960s, 70s, artists who were oftentimes quite political. And El Zir Cortor, as you can tell here, he lived until 2015 and he was painting until 2015. So it's not like he wasn't a contemporary artist at the moment, but he was an artist who was working in a very different style than the works of much of the institution's exhibition program. So I find this work just fascinating in terms of the fact that, El Zir Cortor was at the time, Chicago-based artist working in a figurative realist style and celebrating an aspect of Black culture that wasn't as widely recognized in New York at the time. And so for this work it was important for me for this work to be in the exhibition, particularly because it was so, it was the first painting that entered the collection. And so it's important in terms of thinking about the history of how to build a collection. And I wanted that to be reflected in Black Refractions. Okay, so now I'm gonna talk about kind of these larger considerations that went into building out this exhibition. And so for me, there were really 4 big kind of buckets of thought in terms of ensuring that the exhibition reflected the collection and the institution in a way that was central to the mission. And so this first section, it's not even a section, it's a section in the exhibition, I should say, but this first kind of larger understanding of what we wanted to include in the exhibition is founders, right? And so just thinking about, again, the importance of that moment in the 1960s and into the early 1970s of those artists who worked so hard to ensure that not only their work would be represented, but the work of other artists would be represented in institutions. So for me, it was important that we included this work by Betty Blayton Taylor. If you remember that I mentioned her name earlier, she was actually one of the founders of the institution. She served as the board secretary for a number of years. So she was part of, like, incredibly part of that founding moment. She, was involved from the very beginning in the conversations about what an institution could look like, what this institution could look like, but also was an artist herself, right? And so thinking about the importance of the fact that the institution was founded not just by, collectors or philanthropists, but also by artists, right, who were deeply invested in thinking about an institution that celebrated the work of other Black artists. And so Betty Blayton Taylor being someone who not only was an important educator within the community, who not only invested so much of her career in advancing the work of the arts, but also children, but who was an artist herself, and one who, pushed the boundaries as a female abstract painter in that moment, a Black female abstract painter. She was really experimenting in a way that I think needs a little bit more attention and fleshing out. And then two other artists, just in terms of their importance in the work that they did as activists. So Norman Lewis on the left here and Benny Andrews on the right. I showed you their images earlier. They were incredibly important in terms of agitating for the work of artists of African descent within institutions. And so their work too, incredibly important in terms of thinking about their own considerations. So Norman Lewis, an abstract painter who was considered part of the abstract expressionist circle, right? And we're thinking about the 1950s, abstract expressionism being the dominant art movement of the time. And he was very much a part of that circle in those conversations, but often left out, right, of the larger narrative. And so straddling those two worlds, being an abstract artist and a Black artist, and his incredible contributions as a result of that, right? And then Benny Andrews dedicated himself to being an activist throughout his career and an educator, was co-founder of, the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, but also so many other organizations that really brought about change, and someone who injected his politics into his work, right? Was very deliberate about calling out racism and injustices and inequities in the world, and made no qualms about that, right? Wanted it to be understood that this was his position. Two other artists, Romare Bearden and Melvin Edwards. Bearden, someone who's very central to the story of Harlem, right? He was very much involved from the beginning in terms of, celebrating Harlem as a location, as a space. He was the first art director of the Harlem Cultural Council, which was formed a couple years before the Studio Museum opened. And also, again, just an incredibly gifted artist in terms of what he brought in terms of collage, right? The use of collage, celebrating Black lives and Black history in his works that reflected so much of his experiences growing up in North Carolina, but also, the street, right? Thinking about Harlem as a vibrant community. And Melvin Edwards. Melvin Edwards is someone whom we consider part of our founding group, primarily because he was so involved in kind of the behind the scenes aspects of the institution. William T. Williams talks about how he and Edwards cleaned out the space that was then used for the artist in residence studios. So thinking again about that contribution in terms of that overall understanding of the founding moment, but then also Edwards serving as a board member, serving on our board of trustees later on in the 80s. So again, celebrating kind of a larger understanding of what founders are. And then just these two final works, Sam Gilliam and Elizabeth Catlett. So two artists who are working outside of the New York art scene, but also just important in that early moment in the institution's history. So Sam Gilliam, an artist working out of DC, so within kind of this larger understanding of the Washington Color School, but someone who was within the New York art world. He was included in X the Fourth Power, the exhibition at the Studio Museum, and just someone who was also just thinking broadly about abstraction in this moment. Elizabeth Catlett, an artist who had moved to Mexico City in the 40s, but who had a solo retrospective at the Studio Museum in 1971, which was a major kind of international issue because she was a Mexican citizen at the time. And so had to get basically a special pass in order to attend the opening of that exhibition. But again, someone who contributed so much in terms of thinking about what it meant for Black representation, right? Who worked across sculpture and works on paper to celebrate the Black figure, to celebrate the Black woman in particular, and the mother and child. This is a later work by her, but just thinking about, again, her contributions in that moment to the larger understanding of what it meant to contribute to the art world. Okay, moving on to kind of the second overall conceptual consideration is Harlem, right? So as I mentioned, Harlem being so important to our mission, with it being part of our name, but also so grounding in terms of informing a lot of the work that we do, not only on the curatorial side, but within education and public programs to ensure that we're serving our larger community. And so thinking about Harlem as a site, as I'm sure you guys know, if you've read the didactics for this section, their own Harlems, I got the title from a quote from Jacob Lawrence, who talked about Harlem and how incredibly important it was to him and how it helped shape his artistic career even long after he left. And so he talked about the importance of people finding their own Harlems wherever they were, meaning this idea that Harlem is not just a physical location, but it's an idea. It's a psychic space. It's a space that you can create for yourself wherever you are, right? By finding community, by finding your own community. And so again, thinking about Jacob Lawrence and how incredibly tied he was to Harlem and the understanding of Harlem, including this painting in the exhibition was important. I also just love the metaphor of building, right? He over a long period of his career made works about architecture and building and construction because it was about the constructing of, right? What does it mean for us to build ourselves, to build what we want as an understanding of ourselves and our community. And so for us to include this work was just a way to nod to that understanding, right? Nod to that commitment of constructing a community for ourselves and celebrating that. Two other works in thinking about Harlem. So Daoud Bey on the left, someone who grew up in Queens, but who had family in Harlem, and so came up to Harlem on the weekends to celebrate with family or visit family. And so embarked on a series called Harlem USA in the 1970s as a young person in his late teens and early 20s. It really was about capturing Harlem in all of its complexity and all of its richness, really capturing the people of Harlem. And so thinking about that in relationship to another artist, 40 years later, Jordan Castile, who was an artist in residence, who does the same thing, right? In terms of, she was someone who did not grow up in New York, grew up in Colorado, and was incredibly inspired by Harlem as a community, as a neighborhood, as a site, and would spend a lot of time walking from her apartment, which was in Harlem, to the studio space in the museum, and encountering people, right, and making friends with them, and really embarked on a project that was about celebrating those people. So Kevin the Kite Man, whom you see here, was someone she would frequently see outside of her studio window. This building, the Adam Clayton Powell Jr. State Office Building, is directly across the street from the museum. So she would look out of her third floor studio window and see him. And so one day went up to him and spoke to him and took his photo. And it's really about celebrating him as an individual, embarking on a project of representation of Black men, right? Countering the invisibility or the stereotypical representations that you would find in a lot of not only art history, but also in social media and news. But also it was a celebration of Harlem, right? A love letter to Harlem in terms of finding these moments, these people, these personalities who really spoke to the amazing kind of complexity of Harlem as a location. And then some other works that are less specific about Harlem, but were deeply rooted in thinking about the institution's location in Harlem. So this work, Glenn Ligon, Give Us a Poem, was cited, as you can probably see here, in the foyer of our old building. So it was visible from the street, as I believe it is at UMFA as well. And is on 24/7 as it is at UMFA. So this idea that people, when they walked past the museum, would see this work was very deliberate, right? It was a way for us to engage with the community whether or not we were open, but it was also a way to reflect Ligon's like deep message here, right? This is me, we, taken from a line that Muhammad Ali said. He was giving a lecture at Harvard University, I think in 1975, and someone in the audience asked him to give them a poem, and he said, me, we. Very simple, 2 words, but it reveals the complexity of that moment in a way that is so relevant and poignant today, right? Me as an individual, we as a collective, how that reflects, right? It's is so complicated, right? You think of it as being 2 short words that are mirrors of each other, but in fact, it reveals the deep kind of tensions and fissures that can often exist in terms of thinking about ourselves within a collective. And then this work, David Hammond's, this is the African American flag. This is a later version of an earlier project he did of creating an edition series of these larger, full-scale flags. And then later on, he did a special edition for our building. And this is our second location. So after we moved from the loft, we moved into this building. This special project flew outside of our building every day, weather permitting. And so again, thinking about how Harlem, how our institution was recognized because of Glenn Ligon's work and also David Hammond's work, and how the visibility of our institution was reflected in these 2 really important but very different works to the community. And so being able to include this work was a late addition, but one that we are happy to be able to do. And then the third overarching idea was the Artist in Residence program. So I mentioned the studio program at the beginning. The Artist in Residence program was the second of those kind of 3 founding initiatives. The third being the Film Institute, which was something that I'm not going to talk about, but the studio program and the Artist in Residence program, 2 of those 3 founding initiatives, with the Artist in Residence program being the only one that's still in existence today. We're incredibly proud to have had over 100 artists come through that program. It really has laid the foundation for how we understand ourselves as an institution, and how we understand our mission, right? So again, supporting the work of artists of African descent who are living, who are working, and providing them with an opportunity to embed themselves within an institution. So William T. Williams, whose work you see here, was the person who came up with the idea of the Artist in Residence program. It was one of 2 proposals that he came up with as an MFA student at Yale. And for him, it was really about the importance of professional development for the artist, right? It was about, again, putting the artist within an institution, so providing them with the opportunity to understand how a museum works from the inside, but also allowing them to work, embed themselves within a community. And so the importance of Harlem within that the original conception of the program is something that still stands today. And you'll see so many of the artists that come out of the residency incredibly inspired and informed by Harlem as a site, which I just talked about with Jordan Castile. And so for William T. Williams, this program, in terms of supporting the work of artists of African descent, was one that really spoke to the recognition, right, that artists needed financial support, that they needed studio space. And so the fact that we have had so many incredible artists come through this program is one that we recognize always. And so I know Avery and Cynthia shared some of the questions that you guys had before the talk, and I know one of the questions was about the fact that we name our artists in residence in our labels, and that's something we do as an institution always when we have exhibitions at the museum. But it was something we decided to do for the labels that went out for Black Refractions as a way to, again, pin this, the incredible importance of this program and the fact that it helped shape the careers of so many artists that we know today. And so that recognition is something that we made sure to include throughout the exhibition. But also for me, it was important to think about the totality of the program, right? We've now had this program up and running for over 50 years. What does it mean to look at artists who came out of this program over the course of those 50 years? And so there's at least one artist from every decade of the program's life. And so we have Leroy Clark here on the left. As you can see, he was an artist in residence for a number of years. When the program was first formed, it wasn't as structured as it now is today. But he spent, 3 or 4 years at the museum and gifted this work, which was created before his residency, but was painted shortly after he arrived in New York from Trinidad and Tobago, and really was an understanding of, Black liberation globally, right? So that moment in the 1960s, right, where a lot of countries under colonial rule were gaining their independence, right, was incredibly informative on not only a local level, but also on an international level, right, a scale that artists were now understanding, right, this post-colonial moment for themselves. And so Leroy Clark here on the left, and then Marion Hassinger on the right, an artist who's looking very deeply at materials and nature and kind of the tension between those two things. So this work, I know also in that first gallery, is just a work that I always find so deeply resonant and moving in terms of the incredible power that it has, right, when you're standing in front of it. And so Marin's someone who uses a lot of industrial materials that are difficult to handle, right, and master, and acknowledge that tension that exists between kind of those industrial materials and nature. And we see that reflected in this work, River. Two other artists, Carrie James Marshall who was an artist in residence in the 1980s. This work, Silence is Golden, came out, was painted during his residency. So again, thinking about the importance of the residency and how fruitful it was for a lot of artists in thinking through their own artistic practice. And so around this time, Carrie James Marshall really thinking through what it meant to use the color Black as a very deliberate, poignant, pointed way, right? Exploring the nuances of the color Black. And so we have this work in our collection, and again, a gift of the artist. And then Leonardo Drew, an artist in residence in the early 1990s, working through ideas of materiality similar to Marion Hassinger, but his works evoke a sense of the passing of time and memory and loss. And so we can maybe talk later about kind of the complexities of installing some of these works, particularly in a remote install period, which maybe I'll get into at the end. But Leonardo Drew's work, incredibly powerful in terms of kind of thinking not only from this idea of passing of time, but also he's making very deliberate art historical references, right? Someone who is inspired by Pete Mondrian, right? And thinking about the grid. And so that being in conversation with his use of these various materials that look like they've been aged. And then finally, 3 other works kind of getting us into the 21st century. Kehinde Wiley, an artist in residence in the early 2000s. This is a work that really straddles his MFA period at Yale and his AIR, artist in residence moment. Kehinde Wiley, if many of you are familiar with his work, really found his the style that he is known for today, in which he invites people to pose for paintings that reflect old master works or other European and American paintings at the Studio Museum while he was a resident. He was walking in Harlem down the street, I think it was on 126th Street, and came across a wanted poster of a young Black man. And it really started him thinking about representation, right? Who gets to be represented and why? how they're represented. And so for him, that moment was really pivotal in his career in kind of really transforming his practice. And so that acknowledgement that, the residency, even if, it was kind of serendipitous that he found this wanted poster, can really be transformative, right? As a moment to take a breath, take space, get away from the art world and really just focus on your work in a studio setting, is what we really try to strive for our artists in residence. Wengeshi Mutu, an artist again in the early 2000s, who is looking at and investigating representation of Black women in the media, looking specifically sometimes at publication imagery. So National Geographic being being a publication that she frequently calls for images, but also kind of that intersection of looking at Black representations of people of African descent and technology and the environment. So a lot of her works really kind of investigating that tension and causing us to think more critically about it. And then finally, Jennifer Packer, one of our more recent artists in residence from 2013. Here we have a work, Ivan, her paintings really looking closely at interiority and inviting us into these really special, intimate moments. Her works frequently feature subjects that are family or friends. And so as a whole, her body of work is thinking about kind of opening up the door to more private moments as a way to investigate that space and that tension that exists between giving us too much information and not enough information about who her subjects are. So that's a quick run through of the AIR program. And then the final kind of overarching idea was thinking more broadly about these global conversations that happen. Much of our collection is based on, is work created by artists living in the United States, right? It's because we are an art organization based in New York and we work with living artists. And so as a result, our collection is very primarily focused on African-American artists. But we wanted to also think broadly, right? Because this is not just, it's not an issue, or it's not just about artists who are living in the US, but also thinking critically about what it meant to have global conversations, to put artists in conversation with one another. And so here, thinking about artists who lived and worked on the continent in Africa, Mashak Gaba on the left here, who actually created this body of work while he was in residence. I think he had a residency at PS1 in Queens, New York, but was incredibly inspired by both the hair braiding salons that he saw in Harlem, and also Manhattan skyscrapers. So this body of work, a celebration of that tension, but also an acknowledgement that hair braiding and architecture are two examples of modernity, right? It's a celebration of beauty, different types of beauty. And then on the right here, a work by Seydou Keita, who's a Malian photographer who really committed himself to studio portraiture throughout his career. He was working, started working kind of in the 1940s and 50s in a independence moment. So this work created just a couple years before Mali gained independence from France. So this understanding of people in a moment of transformation, right? In a moment of figuring out not only their personal identity, but also their identity as a country as they moved from being in colonial, under colonial rule, French colonial rule, into being an independent country. Two other works, Audubon Nkanga and Odile Donald Odita, thinking again about kind of the fluidity of an understanding of what it meant to be international, right, very broadly. So Audubon Nkanga, born in Nigeria, but lives and works in Belgium. And so someone who is very much interested in questioning ideas of our relationship to land and environment. So we see a work here that puts the conversation around houseboy, right? The tensions of that term and the incredible kind of ridiculousness of the use of that term and all of that that it encapsulates. But thinking about it in terms also of technology, right? This automaton, right? This more kind of robotic figure, and asking us to think about labor, what it means that we have centuries of enslaved peoples, not only in the US, but around the world. What it means that there are still so many laborers that are primarily people of color, that are primarily very low paid. And so putting, Nkanga, someone who is thinking very much about the historical moment, but also this contemporary moment as well, and how these issues have extended across time. Odili Donald Adita, someone who was born in Nigeria, but was raised in the Midwest. So has a deep understanding of what it means to have these dual identities, identities that can often be in conflict with one another, but also ones that allow him to celebrate not only modernity, but Western modernity, but also African modernity, right? African culture. And so his work goes into deep investigations of color, not only from a very technical point of view, from thinking about color theory and perception, but also from a socio-political point of view. What is color, right? So someone who investigating in a very deliberate and crafted way as well. I'm pretty sure he said that he doesn't actually use the same color ever. He's creating his colors based on the works in themselves. And so thinking again about the complexity and nuances of color, right? And the incredible amount of colors that exist in the world, and how that is also very political in a way. And then, these two works, Lorraine Grady and Fred Wilson, both US artists, but thinking about Africa. So Lorraine O'Grady went to Egypt and was incredibly inspired by the fact that she was surrounded by people who looked like her for the first time in her life, right, as an adult, being around people who look like her. And so embarked on this series called the Miscegenated Family Album that also investigated her own relationship and the tense relationship that she had with her sister Devonia, who passed away at a young age. And so we see here Lorraine herself, but it's titled as Devonia's sister Lorraine because it's about Devonia rather than about Lorraine. And then in comparison with Nefertiti's sister. So this work, again, investigating the complexity of identity, the incredible complexity of thinking about skin and skin tone and what it means to be light-skinned. And so again, a reference to that in the series title, Miscegenated Family Album, but one that also looks at a longer arc of history, right? What does it mean to think about where you come from and who you are? And so this body of work, really putting that into the conversation, using photographs of her own family side by side with photographs of sculptures of Nefertiti's larger family. Fred Wilson on the right, here Atlas. Wilson, well known for taking objects from, culture, such as you see here with this, I don't even know what it is, but it's of a Black man as a waiter holding up a tray, I guess, that was used as something. I think it's actually a calling card sculpture that was used to hold kind of calling cards. But Wilson collecting these materials from kind of everyday life that people had in their homes or displayed in public spaces, and showing us, right, that by juxtaposing these materials, these objects, calling into question, right, the use of them, right, calling into question this longer arc of history of thinking about how everyday objects circulate in the world. And so this work with those Black pins, thinking about the idea of the circulation of Black bodies, right? And so pointing exactly to where people of African descent have settled and live. And then finally, just these two works, Buford Delaney and Isaac Julian. Buford Delaney, a US artist who moved to France to find community, right? He's someone who existed kind of always in tension with himself, existed within the Harlem community, right, was very much deeply in conversation with other Black artists, but also lived and worked and was in conversation with the white gay community, artistic community in downtown Manhattan, in Greenwich Village. And so had these really two separate lives that he can never fully reconcile, and struggled with it kind of throughout kind of his early life. And so ended up moving to Paris in, I think, the 1950s, because Paris at the time was seen as being a lot more open, allowing for a lot more freedom for not only people of color, but also for gay men and women. And so for him, Paris was a way to achieve that freedom and relieve some of that tension that he wasn't able to reconcile in New York. And this work painted in Paris, finding, again, his own community of people. He was someone that was very much embedded within the music community. So that work. And then Isaac Julian, a Black British filmmaker and installation artist, who in this work is looking at a US filmmaker. And so again, thinking about those global conversations that happen, that cross-cultural conversations that happen, celebrating the work of Melvin Van Peebles, a preeminent filmmaker known primarily for his blaxploitation films in the 1970s. Again, thinking about conversations that happen across time, right? So Van Peebles working primarily in the 1970s, and this work in the early 2000s, but also thinking about the influences that cross borders, that cross nations, and how these conversations continue to exist well into the present and will continue to exist. So that's what I have. I ran through the last bit of it quickly because I knew that I was running out of time and going over. So I am happy to answer any questions you have, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so we can all see each other.
And just to go over the question structure, I think we're going to open up questions first to ASA Club members. And then after we've given them some time to ask their questions, then we'll open it up to everyone else. And if you have a question, please just raise your Zoom hand so we can call on you.
You can raise your Zoom hand by going into participants and selecting the raise hand feature also, if you didn't know.
Albert, do you want to kick it off?
Okay, I'm a huge fan of David Hammond. How did you manage to land two pieces by that guy? Because he's notoriously very difficult to exhibit. I mean, he's often played around. I mean, that's kind of the point. You know, I mean, he's one of the most playful. I really love his work. So, how did you manage to talk to his studio and procure two works by him for the show? Because he did not just one, but two. So
Yeah.
He's very elusive.
He is, and that's one of the best things about him. So, you know, this was a collection-based exhibition, so we did not have to go through kind of maybe the normal complexities you do and having to secure loans for an exhibition. So that was one thing that worked in our favor. The other thing is that David Hammonds has always been incredibly supportive of the Studio Museum. He was an artist in residence, right? So he understands the importance of the institution's mission and the importance of the residency program. And so he's always been supportive of the institution. He's gifted works, not only by himself, but also by other artists as a way to ensure that the Studio Museum had a representative kind of collection body of his work. So we are incredibly lucky to have, I don't exactly know how many works, but I believe it's somewhere around 6 to 8 works by him done over a number of decades. And so he has been extremely generous in that way. I will say for the two works that are in the exhibition, Too Obvious, which is the sculpture that is of a piggy bank with cowrie shells, that work, if I'm remembering correctly, entered our collection from a gift of Ed Clark, who is an artist. I'm gonna have to confirm that, but if I'm remembering correctly, it is a gift of Ed Clark. And that was done very deliberately in terms of, again, David Hammond's thinking through what it would mean to support the gifting of other artists' work, right? And so we have work gifted by Lorna Simpson Lorna Simpson gifted David Hammond's work. David Hammond's gifted someone else's work. And so there's a whole way in which these artists were thinking collectively about supporting each other and also supporting the Studio Museum as a result. The other work we have in our collection is the African American flag, and that work entered our collection through the bequest of Peggy Cooper Kafritz in 2018. Peggy Cooper Kafritz was an incredible collector in DC, but also an educator and a civil rights activist. And she passed away in 2018 and left her collection jointly to the Studio Museum in Harlem and the Duke Ellington School of the Arts, which she co-founded in the 1970s. So through that extremely generous bequest, the Studio Museum actually ended up acquiring over 400 works from her personal collection, and the Ellington School got, I think, over 250 works. And so that work, the flag, hung in her home, was installed in her home, and entered our collection as a result of the bequest. But I will also say, I referenced the flag that hung outside of our building and that will hang outside of our new building once it's constructed. That, again, was a special project that he did for the museum, in thinking about supporting the institution again, but also thinking about community, right? He was very much embedded in Harlem. He doesn't live there, but he is very much thinking about Black space, right? What it means to be a neighborhood that is very deeply rooted in an African-American history and culture. And so for him, that work, which references the Pan-African flag that was created by Marcus Garvey in the earlier 20th century with those, the Pan-African colors, the red, black, and green, was important in terms of being cited in Harlem, tied to the building, tied to the Studio Museum. And what I love about that work in particular is that the vendors in Harlem on 125th Street who, have their businesses right outside of the museum and all of, basically down the street, some of them actually sell their own reproductions of that flag. And so you see it all over the place in Harlem. And that is something that Hammonds loves, right? The appropriation of his own work is just, it falls in line with his own philosophy of his artistic practice. And I think it just shows you the importance of that flag to the very local community that it flies outside of. I hope that answered your question.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. Especially because I'm a huge fan of his.
As am I. Any other questions?
Do any other awesome members have questions right now? Okay, I actually have a question as an awesome member. I'm overflowing with questions, but I'll pick one specifically. So in the perspective that you were talking about how artists went through the Artist in Residence program, there's plaques for the different artists who went through Artist in Residence program in the actual exhibit, and then others don't have that. To what extent do you think that having the plaques to show the Artist in Residence program artists creates more of a sense of heritage? And to what extent do you think that stratification leads into other themes, such as the call and response theme?
Yeah. It's interesting. We had this longer conversation about the inclusion of the Artist in Residence line at Kalamazoo Institute of Arts, which was the second venue of the show, because they have a school. And so for them to have an artist artists actively going through those galleries and artists tied to the institution was something that we then talked about, because would it be confusing to have an Artist in Residence line on the label if there wasn't within the institution that it was situated in, they had their own type of program. And I think, for us, it was something that we didn't intend to do at the beginning, but that was almost like a duh moment afterwards, like as we were writing the labels, like, why wouldn't we call all of our Artists in Residence out? It's a point of incredible celebration for us to be able to say all of these artists came through our program, right? All of these artists, sometimes many of them got their start, right? Embarked, gained visibility as a result of the platform that the program presented. And so we wanted to do that. It wasn't necessarily a requirement for the venues to exhibit that, right? And again, in thinking about the flexibility of this exhibition, right? All of the labels, the Studio Museum wrote all of the labels for the show, and all of the didactics in general for the show, but each venue was allowed to edit them, to write their own if they wanted to craft the text in the ways that they wanted. And so each venue did, edit the labels, at least somewhat, with one venue completely rewriting the labels. And so I think that what I love about the exhibition is that there is no artist in residence section, right? Unless you wanted to incorporate that as a section. And so you see them throughout the show, right? And so it's kind of like a subversive way of celebrating ourselves running throughout the show, but it's also a way to indicate how incredibly diverse the program is, right? The artists that have come out of the program have worked in all different media. And I think, Avery, I really liked, if I remember correctly, you pointed out specifically call and response as something. And that grouping, that section was one that I found incredibly resonant, not only because it speaks so much to, the Black church and Black literature and music, but also because call and response is so much of what these artists do, right? Any work really can fall into that section because it is about recognizing, calling something out, and then having an artistic response to that. And I think that artist in residence program allows for that to happen in a way that, I don't know, I just find to be really interesting. I think I went on a path, and I don't know if I went back to where you wanted it to, but for me, being able to celebrate the program was something that we considered from the very beginning, in order to ensure that, the institution's mission was present throughout the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was amazing. Thank you.
Did we have any other awesome members who want to jump in before we open it up? Albert?
Okay, I got another one. I'm actually appreciative. So I'm curious, Theaster Gates. I didn't see any of his work. He's a big influence on my art practice. So I'm curious, where did he go? That's all I'm going to ask.
So I will tell you, as you can imagine, the Studio Museum does not have every work or a work by every artist, right? It's not possible for us to do so. We are a museum that was not founded with a collection. So therefore also was not founded with an endowment to acquire work. And so the collection has grown incrementally, mostly through the generosity of donors. I think about 80% of our collection actually comes from donors. And then we started an acquisition committee in the early 2000s that allows us to selectively purchase work. I'm giving you background information that you probably don't need. That doesn't answer your Theaster Gaze question. But I will say that, we have exhibited Theaster's work. He's incredibly important, obviously, to our mission and to the institution. He's someone that we have a very close relationship with, just in terms of his own practice, but also the collaboration or the work that he's doing in Chicago, right? It has a lot of resonance with the Studio Museum mission. We did not have an opportunity to acquire his work. However, again, through the generosity of Peggy Cooper Kafritz's bequest, we now have a work by Theaster Gates in our collection. This bequest, though, came in at 2018, at the end of 2018, when the show was opening at MOAD in January 2019. So we were only able to actually include a select number of works from this bequest into the exhibition. And that was very deliberately done by including works by former artists in residence. So you'll note that the David Hammond's African American flag is not in the exhibition catalog. I don't know if you'll know that, but it's true. The David Hammond's flag is not in the catalog. Neither is the Kehinde Wiley tapestry. And I'm trying to think, those might be the two examples. I can't think of another one right now. So that was because the catalog was already done, but before we got the bequest. And so the bequest was an opportunity to allow us to show our artists in residence's practice in a bit more depth, right? The Kehinde Wiley work we have in our collection that I showed you is from 2000, 2001. The tapestry is a much later work. So for us to be able to show you kind of how an artist's practice has evolved over time was something that we thought about, and which the K-Fritz bequest allowed us to do very selectively in terms of thinking specifically about the Artist in Residence program. So that's why Gates was not included, but he is actually in our collection now. And I will say that just broadly, there's so many artists that we could have included, but that we were not able to because we couldn't create an exhibition checklist that was all the works in our collection, unfortunately. And so we really had to hone in on the specifics of kind of thinking through those 4 larger buckets, but also thinking more deeply about how these works could be displayed at these institutions. So I kind of referenced that when I was talking about the Leonardo Drew. That work, for those of you who have seen it in person, is very large. You know, it's, I think, maybe about 7 or 8 feet tall. It's also, as you can imagine, incredibly heavy. And so the complexities of kind of creating a traveling show, and one that we knew would be going to 6 different venues across the country, crisscrossing the country twice. You know, it went from San Francisco to the Gibbs. Now, I think Kalamazoo was the 3rd venue, sorry. It went from San Francisco to the Gibbs in Charleston, South Carolina, to Kalamazoo, Michigan, to, you know what I mean? It was going all over the place. And so we had to really also take into consideration the safety and care of these works to make sure that we weren't, you know, going to damage them as they traveled across the country and were displayed across the country over the course of 2 years. And so that Leonardo Drew work was one that we had to think really deeply about, you know, in terms of ensuring that it was safe for that work to travel. We have larger Drews in our collection, and that was actually, you know, we were considering including a larger work just to show kind of the scale at which he works at, but it became pretty obvious that that wasn't going to be possible, you know, to not only travel it, right, to fit it on the trucks, but also for our institutions to install. Like, we couldn't ask that of 6 institutions to try to install the huge works within their galleries. Any other questions?
I think we can open it up to non-awesome members now if anyone would like to ask a question. Oh, I'm not sure who went first, Connor or Eli. Let's do Connor first.
Eli raised their hand first, so they can go instead.
Let's do Eli first then.
Hi. As you've been giving your lecture, I can't help but think about the Kelly Jones reading that I did a while back. It's not enough to say Black is beautiful. Like, the reading, I mean, basically she's talking about like group exhibitions focusing on I mean, like, I don't mean to just summarize the reading, because more my question is, compared to exhibits where primarily white institutions like the Whitney Museum use group shows as a way to prove that they are showing diverse work and acknowledging artists from different backgrounds, and then not showing solo shows of artists from marginalized identities. How is it working with primarily white institutions from the Studio Museum, where there's obviously a very different perspective on what it means to have a group show of primarily Black artists and artists of African descent? Like, how is it trying to engage with these institutions that aren't coming from that place, and that are coming from a place of often using group shows as a way to kind of cover their asses and kind of show that they're able to put forward work from people other than male white artists, while also not being willing to show solo shows by marginalized artists? I don't know if that came together quite.
Yeah. I think I have a very long answer, and I'm going to try to keep it shorter because I tend to ramble. So I will say, if you're in referencing specifically the venues for this show, we had an incredible time across the board with all 6 venues. And that was primarily because each of the venues was very much invested in this exhibition, but also in the engagement that would be possible by investing in this exhibition. So just to give you a broader sense of the scale at which these venues were working. So one of the funders of the exhibition is Art Bridges, which provided funds for each of the venues to do education and public programs related to the show. And so part of that requirement was to think very deeply about how to engage the communities that perhaps were ones that were not going to these institutions normally, right? And so that, I think, allowed for each of these institutions to consider their own place within, consider the institution's own place within the neighborhoods and communities that they were embedded in, right? And so that's a kind of the first kind of overarching understanding of what the exhibition might make possible for each of the institutions that it went to. I will also say that, I talked a lot in the beginning about the exclusion of a lot of the artists in the show, but Black artists in general, in the founding moment in the 1960s and early 1970s. And I think, obviously those conversations are still happening today, right? It's still incredibly urgent for us to think about what it means for institutions across the country to be open to, as you said, right? It's not just about the group exhibition where it's almost easy, right, to do that, but it's about really recognizing the importance of solo exhibitions, retrospective exhibitions. And I have to say, I'm very optimistic that that's happening. I think it's maybe not at the scale and the frequency that we wanted, but it is happening more frequently than it was, say, 10 years ago, right? And so if we're thinking about kind of this larger arc, this longer arc, we can see the progress that has been made, right? And I'll just point to the Whitney Museum because Kelly Jones's article is about specifically the Whitney Museum in that moment, in the late 60s, early 70s. And the fact that they, the Whitney basically recognized that they were excluding Black American artists from their exhibition program and embarked on a period of over the course of 6 years, installed 12 exhibitions, 11 solo shows, and 1 group exhibition from 69 to 75, right? And that was a way, as a beginning, as a corrective to the long exclusion of these artists from their exhibition program. If we look at today, right, what's on view at the Whitney Museum today? They have an exhibition of the Komoinge photographers, right, which was an exhibition that was organized by the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, but that traveled to the Whitney. And that was actually delayed, I believe, because the Whitney wanted it to be seen, right? It was delayed because it was supposed to open during the museum's closure due to COVID, and it's now on view until next month, I think, and then travels elsewhere, right? Up next or soon, Julie Moretu, a solo exhibition of her work, co-organized between the Whitney Museum and LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. They're working on Daoud Bey project. They're also working on a David Hammons public installation. And so just considering that one example of a museum institution in New York City, obviously still very complicated, right? Obviously the Whitney is still being called to task for other types of discriminatory practices or other types of just art world practices. But I think it's safe to say that we are at least, there is a broader understanding and recognition that this work needs to happen, right? That these exhibitions need to happen. And then Connor, right?
Hi. My question is kind of a twofold question. One is, you mentioned earlier before, like towards the start of it, that like each museum or each stop along the exhibition has certain pieces shown than other ones. Was there any consideration as to what pieces were going to be shown in the UMFA based off of like Utah's culture and the surrounding environment around it? And specifically, were there any pieces that were chosen to fit the UMFA's building? Like, were there any positives or negatives to setting up the exhibition inside the building?
Yeah. You know, one of the tragedies for me about this whole pandemic moment, aside from kind of the larger complexities of loss of human life, is the fact that I did not get to go to Utah for install. It's very obviously selfish reasoning, but I had so looked forward to being there in person to be able to install the show. Luckily, I was able to I visited a year and a half ago, and spoke at length with Whitney about the gallery spaces. She walked me through and showed me each of the galleries, and kind of we started at that moment thinking about what the install could look like in the building, right? And so Whitney has spent an incredible amount of time being very, very considerate about the visitor experience and the ways in which the visitor walks through those galleries and experiences the show, right? And so for the Glenn Ligon Give Us a Poem to be in the foyer was something that we talked about, right? And that we signed off on, obviously, because it's not a gallery space. And luckily that work existed in our own lobby. And so it was possible for us to get permission from the gallery from the artist studio to exhibit this work in non-environmentally controlled gallery spaces. But for her, again, to be able to display it on that first wall, as soon as you walk into the museum that you see it, was a very deliberate choice, right? To engage with people from the beginning of their experience at the museum and seeing that work, not only because it's so powerful in and of itself, but because it sets the stage for what the viewer expects of Black Refractions as a whole, right? And then again, like as you walk through the show, right, that long view of Barclay Hendricks' Lottie Mama was something that she knew from the very beginning that she wanted to do, right? She wanted viewers to have that experience of seeing that work from a distance, right? From the I think you can see it from the ticket desk, right? From the entrance, right? You have a clear view of that work. And so that work, again, it's the work on our cover. It's probably the most iconic work in our collection. It was important for her to have that as the sightline, as the way to, again, set that stage, to announce to the institution that what this exhibition was going to be. It is going to be a celebration of works by artists of African descent, very deliberately so with that one particular work. And then just in terms of thinking through other types of considerations and maybe more boring considerations, but you always have to think about like size of works, right? Scale, like how they fit within galleries. And that's one of the things that we knew from the beginning, that we didn't want to confine the venues to exhibiting these 20 works in this section, right? Because that's not possible, right? It's not possible to have that requirement for every venue, because each of those galleries are different, right? I mean, the UMFA's gallery space is somewhat unique in that you have that one long gallery with the soaring ceiling, right? That allows for these larger scale works to have a lot of room, to have a lot of breadth, right? And then you have those more intimate spaces that have lower ceilings and are smaller. And so for Whitney, she knew that she needed to install those larger scaled works in that, I don't know what the galleries are called, I'm sorry, but in that longer space, like that larger gallery space, because it allowed for the works to actually have, a more commanding presence, right? And so for that Sam Gilliam, right, I've never seen that Sam Gilliam installed on a wall that had that much ceiling height, right? And so it's transformative. It changes your experience of the work to be able to see it in a space that is not as physically, cramped, right? It's the same with the Marion Hassinger. You can't install that work in a smaller gallery space, right? Because it needs the breadth of the space. And so that section then ended up being, materiality on that kind of second half of that room, a gallery, because of the recognition that those works required the larger ceiling height. And then other considerations that came up, and Whitney can probably speak more eloquently about this, is that, obviously the Hank Willis Thomas Black Righteous Space is in the Black Box Gallery, right? Because it is an immersive installation that allows for viewer interaction. And that's on a separate floor. I can't remember what floor. I think it's the second floor, on a separate floor. And so for Whitney, she was from the very beginning thinking about the ways in which the exhibition could be seen throughout the museum, right? How do you put this exhibition not just in the designated, perhaps special exhibition galleries, but embedded within the institution itself as in a way for viewers to think critically about the works as they're experiencing the museum in totality, right? And so again, thinking again about the Glenn Ligon in the lobby, setting that stage, having the Hank Willis Thomas in that Black Box Gallery was something that she knew she was going to do because of the nature of the work, but something that was incredibly important to her to do, to be able to say the ideas and themes that you see in Black Refractions continues throughout your visitor experience as you walk through all of the museum, right? And that last gallery, the Salt Gallery, I think it's called, where Their Own Harlems is, that was possible as a result of kind of the fact that this exhibition was originally supposed to open in September and got delayed as a result of COVID. So that gallery space opened up as an exhibition space. And so she jumped on that as an opportunity to once again think about how we can install this exhibition throughout the institution to influence the visitors' understanding of and so the themes resonate throughout your experience of walking through the galleries.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to do Kai's question, and then we're going to wrap it up, and Avery's going to give some closing statements.
Hello. So my question is, like, for this collection that has been around for so long with such a definitive message, do you think the message has shifted over the exhibit's lifespan? And if so, how?
Over the exhibition's lifespans over the last 2 years?
Well, because you talked about the like it being around since the 1960s, like the
Oh yeah, the
yeah,
institution.
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about an institution and a collection, right, is that it's not static. It's constantly changing, right? We, as an institution, acquire, anywhere from, I think, 40 to 100 plus works a year, right? And so the collection constantly takes new shape and constantly has new resonances, not only broadly, but also specifically within works of art. And so I think what you see, if you have seen Black Refractions, which I don't think anyone has here, but if you've seen Black Refractions at different venues, what is so amazing is that the works look different sometimes based on where they're installed, how they're installed, the colors of the walls, what they're next to, etc. But what you understand of the works also changes, right? Like the pairings that each of the venue's curators are making are different. And so it allows you to see these works in new ways that really speaks to the complexity, not only of the individual artist's practice, but also the complexity of art in general, right? The reason why we turn to the arts is that they are always relevant and resonant with the current moment. And so what I find really fascinating about the collection, though, is that because the institution has always focused on supporting primarily living artists of African descent, the collection is always very contemporary to the moment, right? And so the collection has an extreme depth in the 1960s forward, because that's when we were founded, in the 1960s and moving forward, right? It has holes before that period, right? And that's just, I'm gonna say it because it's known, right? We are the Studio Museum in Harlem, but where are the Harlem Renaissance works in our collection? We have a handful, but you would think that we would have greater depth, given that it's the Harlem Renaissance and it's so incredibly important as a cultural movement. But because our founders and our donor base and our artists are all living art, are of the contemporary moment, we are missing some works prior to kind of the mid 20th century moment. And so one of the priorities for us as an institution is to think critically about those holes. And I know institutions do this always, right? But for us, it's very specific, right? It's bounded by the mission of the institution, and it's frankly bounded by time as well, right? Because we are looking primarily at works that are created from the early 1800s forward. And so I think what has changed from the institution's founding in the 60s is first the acknowledgement that a collection is necessary, right? Because we went for 9 years without having a collection policy. But second, thinking really holistically about the collection. It's because the collection is primarily based on the generosity of our donors. We have accepted works, right, which have created an incredibly robust and diverse collection, but we haven't then thought about the works that are missing, right? And I think now is that moment to really think about which artists are not in our collection and that really should be, or how to create more breadth within the artists that we have, right? Are there artists whom we have work by, but perhaps want to acquire more work, right? Is it possible for us to think about these artists who have come through our residency program, and we've acquired work generally from their residency or from earlier in their career? What does it mean to continue collecting them into the future? What does it mean to have an understanding of these artist practices from the time that they were emerging artists in our residency program to now, right? And so that, I think, is what this collection really strives to do, and how it continues to change over time, right? Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does very well. Thank you.
Great. With that brings us to the closure of this lecture and Q&A section. I would love to extend a very, very special thank you to Dr. Connie Choi for being the guest speaker for us tonight and enriching us all with her words on Black Refractions exhibition. If you are not already and you are able to, be sure to visit the UMFA to see the exhibition, which will be on view till April 10th this year again. With the closure of this lecture, I'd like to provide the students here tonight with the link again if you wanted to join. Have it right here. Make sure to copy it if you'd like to join. Thank you for your attendance this evening. I hope to see you all at our next ASHA lecture in March with local arts group, local propagandists. I want to thank everyone who was able to join and wish you all a good rest of your evening. And with that, bye. Thank you all for coming. This was awesome. Bye, thank you. All right, well, thank you so much, Connie. This was awesome.